students, welcome to our course on environmental modeling and simulation. This being the first lecture, I will introduce you to the basic subject of environmental modeling and simulation. What is environmental modeling, why we do it, what are the different approaches, what's the scope of this course and the scope of the tools that you will learn in this course. So let's get started. First question is, why do we need to do environmental modeling? We do environmental modeling for basically two reasons. One is a pure research reason, a research purpose. We have a research question, we need to answer it, or let's say we have a problem and we want to research a solution and then notice or calculate the possible impact of our proposed solutions. So that is one reason why we want to do environmental modeling. The other reason is we want to understand the effect of human behavior, human activities on the environmental processes. And this is particularly very important as our world goes through climate crisis, as we suffer through widespread and almost catastrophic levels of environmental pollution throughout the world. Right now across the globe, we have widespread environmental destruction, which was partly predicted by models that were run many decades earlier. And now we want to do modeling to understand how our current activities, behavior and approaches towards climate adaptation and removal of pollution or pollutants in the environment will have on the environment in the upcoming future. So basically the two big reasons why we do environmental modeling is to answer research questions, and the second is to understand the impact of our behavior and our interventions. So clearly you can see the models do two really important things. First, they help us understand the basic phenomena that's happening in the environment. Environment is actually a very big umbrella term for complex web of interactions that happen on biological level, chemical, geological, and now increasingly so on human scale, whether it comes to society or economy. So environment is a very broad aspect that we are talking about, and there are a lot of things that we still do not understand about the environment, and that's where the research questions come in. So we can do modeling to understand what are the basic principles in which certain aspect of environment are working. So answering the research questions using modeling can help us understand the fundamental principles. Fundamental principles behind environmental processes. Sometimes we can gather data from the environment, but we still don't understand what are the principles behind the data that we have gathered. So that is where we use empirical formula. But once we understand the theory, we can use our understanding of our theory to predict the impact of human interventions and human behavior. This is where the second aspect of utility of environmental models are, which is understanding the impact of human activities. So before I move further, I want to share with you a quote that is often attributed to George Box, who was a very famous modeler himself. But this is a concept that was present and understood by environmental modelers and mathematical modelers way before George Box put it in these many words. All models are wrong, but some are useful. Why is it important to understand this particular quotation? Because it reminds us that no matter how good a model or how accurate the results of our model may be, our model is not same as the reality. Model is basically a simplified map of the reality which can help us understand how the system is behaving and how the system might respond to our interventions and our activities. But a model is not a perfect map. It's a very simplified map, and especially with environmental conditions, environmental systems, the models we use are extremely simplified. And the reason for that is because environment is very complex. This is where the second part of the quotation comes into picture. Some models are useful. So what we want to target when we are doing environmental modeling is not to make a perfect model, a model that is a perfect replica of the reality. Our intention is to make a useful model. How do you define a useful model? A useful model will have acceptable error in its output. It will make logical sense, so it will be logically appropriate. It will be computationally not challenging. So these are some attributes of a model that can be acceptable. It's easy to compute, easy to run the model, it makes logical sense, and the results that it gives us are within the acceptable range of error. Now, when it comes to environmental modeling, we have to understand that it is very important to decide the scope of our model. What will be the scope of our model? Since the model is not a perfect replica of the reality of our environmental systems, it is an abstraction, or in some cases a generalization of what's happening in reality. We have to define what specific part of environmental processes we are targeting. Are we looking at a compound A, how it transports through the environment, what is its fate, how it disintegrates in a particular system, or are we looking at an entire ecological system which is trying to represent a very complex system? When we are modeling environmental systems, we are reducing and removing a lot of processes that are happening in the environment to create a simple, functional, usable model. We have to be very clear about the scope of the model. I'll talk more in detail about what questions we need to ask ourselves when we are deciding how to model and what kind of model to create. But this is important. When we start modeling, we need to know what are the questions, whether it's a research question or whether it is trying to understand the impact of a behavior or an intervention that we are doing to remedy some environmental disaster on environment. So we need to be clear about our objective, and then according to the objective we need to clarify the scope of our model. Now here are some examples of models that people have used in environmental situations. The most common models that are typically taught in undergraduate and even postgraduate level are computing pollution. For example, the model that many BTech students or BSc or BSc mathematics students would be very familiar with probably is the model of Gaussian plume. So for example, there is a stack which is emitting some air pollutant at a particular rate, and the model will help you understand at a particular distance away from the chimney, given the speed of the wind, given the direction of the wind is known to you, you can calculate what will be the concentration of a particular pollutant emitted by the stack, emitted in the chimney at that particular position. Now this is a very typical models, and then the other model would be, for example, let's say I accidentally spill some contaminant that seeps into groundwater and now have a plume of hydrophobic pollutant inside groundwater. How will that plume travel through the groundwater aquifers and how the concentration will change spatially and also temporally. So these are very common kind of models that are done by environmental engineers, scientists and environmental modelers, and these are basically computing the pollution levels spatially and temporally. To be clear, when I talk about spatial models, I am talking about how the concentration of pollution changes over a particular space, whether it is 2D or 3D. And when we are talking about temporal changes, we are looking at how in a particular space, in a given fixed space, how the concentration is changing over time. The other kind of very common environmental models that are used are source identification models, and anyone here who is familiar with air quality models know that source identification is a very common kind of model that is used air pollution when we want to identify, when we want to track the source. Now increasingly this is also used in molecular biological pollution, for example fecal contamination, and we want to find out where the fecal contamination in the particular lake or in a river is coming from, or let's say we have a water body, surface water body, and it is undergoing eutrophication and we want to understand the sources of nutrients and contaminants. So that is where we can use modeling to understand, okay, we know that this particular source is supplying phosphorus or nitrogen in the lake in this particular compound form which has this disintegration, accumulation and sedimentation rate versus source 2, source 3, source 4, so that we can identify which source is contributing how much to the general pollution or general nutrient levels in the lake. Then the third kind of modeling that is very commonly done by environmental modelers is the modeling that we do for EIA, environmental impact assessment. When you do environmental impact assessment, you are trying to gauge the impact of a project that has not even been started, that has not even been implemented. So you have to predict the environmental impact of a proposed project, and the way we do it is by using models that are existing, and sometimes depending on the project you might have to come up with a newer model. Also most of the environmental models are location specific or should be location specific, and I'll give you a very simple example why location specific is important. Location specific, let's take an example of a very simple Gaussian plume model. So let's say we have a chimney here and it is emitting a contaminant, let's call it C, at a given emission rate, let's call it E. right? And we can use the Gaussian plume model to understand. Let's say this is the center line of the plume. We can calculate the concentration of the contaminant C at any given location if we know the direction of the wind, which is along the center line in x-axis as defined, x, y, and z. So we have a very simple Gaussian plume model that I'll actually derive and walk you through the derivation later in the course. Now let's say I give you the model and you can input the values of x, y, z, you can input the meteorological information that you need in the model, and you can get the value of the concentration at this particular location. Now let's change the location, okay? Same model, similar scenario. Same chimney emitting the same contaminant, meteorological conditions are same, but now let's put a high rise building here. The behavior of the smoke that is being emitted by the chimney will change because of presence of this high rise building. So even though the chemical phenomena, the meteorological phenomena, and the physical transportation of the emitted pollutant remain the same in both conditions when there is no high rise building and when there is a high rise building, the behavior of the smoke will change. And to give you some foresight, what will happen is that the building will reflect some of the smoke. So we have to incorporate that if we are trying to model the air quality in a particular location or when there are high rise buildings. Similarly, if now I change the terrain and I add trees and mountains or hills, again we'll have to change the way our model behaves. We'll have to do some adjustments. So briefly, this was to give you an idea that even though the principles may apply similarly across the globe, when we apply models, we have to be site specific. So even if you know some models that you know work very well for a given site, for a given situation, if you're applying it in a new site, remember to make required adjustments. Alrighty, let's look at the other kinds of common models that are used in our field. Responding to accidents. So let's say there is a disaster that happens. A few years ago, actually recently, a particular plant in a particular city in our country released accidentally some chlorine gas, which caused some people to fall sick. So it was an accident. It was not done intentionally. Now let's say such kind of accidents do happen. We want to estimate how long the contaminant will stay in the environment, what will be the number of people who will be exposed to the contaminant, and what kind of health impacts we can expect. So this is a sort of a risk assessment that is done, but it is done for accidents. So I'll write down here, risk assessment is part of assessing the impact of accidents. Let's say there is a landslide and that changes the tectonics. So we might want to do modeling there to understand how the behavior of a dam, how the behavior of a river, and the tectonic plates around that area will be impacted because of the landslide. Now another very common kinds of model that many wastewater engineers and water engineers are very interested in are water related models. And I've already given an example of a groundwater model. Let's say there is a contamination in groundwater and I want to understand the fate and transportation of that contaminant through the aquifers and its interaction with soil and other matrices in and around the aquifer. Then we want to use groundwater models, and there's some really beautiful models, and we'll cover one of them later in the course. Then we have wastewater treatment models. So if you work in a wastewater treatment plant, they will typically have their own black box model because the wastewater treatment plants are pretty standardized in our country. So then that is the entire category of very well done, very well written wastewater models. And then we have water treatment models to help us understand how to go on with water treatment methods. Now what I have not written here in context of water are water pollution models, and the reason I have not written here is because they typically fall under the first category, which is computing pollution levels. Alrighty, so when we look at the models, typically there are three very important parts of the model. First is field application. So field application is I'm running a model to use that model in a very broad field where I have to make decisions on the field and I have to understand how things work. And objective of many environmental models, and some of the field applications are in land and soil. So land management, soil management, your landslides, your geological models, Environmental geological models will all come under land and soil. And we have an entire subsection of models which are climate models, and these are very complex models, and I'll very briefly tell you why they are very complicated models. They're complicated because they are multi-interdisciplinary. And then we have water system models. So remember the water models that I was talking about, whether it is groundwater modeling, wastewater or water modeling, all will come under water systems. Water is essential for lives, and there we have many models for water systems. And then we have agroforestry. You know, one of our biggest asset and arsenal against climate crisis is the way we do our agriculture and the way we manage our forests and maintain them and preserve them, and maybe even do some afforestation. So we are becoming more concerned about how the forests are behaving and the impact of our agriculture, and they are a very different kinds of model, because again, within agroforestry we might want to do some ecosystem studies, we might want to do studies on carbon sequestration, carbon release. So again, these are all field application domain of environmental modeling. The other part of the modeling that you might want to focus on is the processing part. For example, you might say, okay, I love environmental modeling, but I'm not so much interested in the field application part of environmental modeling, but I'm more interested in the computational part, how to optimize different models and how to, for example, coming to optimization, optimizing environmental models is quite challenging, because many a times you don't even know what is the target optimization. What are we trying to target? Are we trying to target for human benefit or for environmental resilience and environmental benefit? So you might want to work on that field itself, or you might want to write better mathematical equations and simulation steps to improve the computational part, to improve the accuracy with which our model predicts, to improve the simulation that we do. For example, in previous decades, since people started using computers for simulation, we have seen an explosion of simulation models and how they have improved over time. Things that are very hard to do by hand are now so much more accessible when we use MATLAB or Octave or R or other software platforms. So maybe you're not so much interested in the application, but you're very interested in the mathematics and the programming, the processing part of the model. The third thing that you can focus on is the goal, the domain that is the goal of environmental modeling. All right, I'm not so interested in where the application is done. Let's say you say I'm not very interested in the mathematics of models or in the simulation part of the modeling, the processing part, but I'm very interested in the outcomes. So this is where forecasting comes into picture. So meteorological models, weather models, climate models. I'm not interested where else, how else I can apply it and how what the mathematics goes behind it. I only want to know if we make these changes in our emission, what will be the impact in sea level rise. Now this is where you're only focusing on the goal. So let's read out some of the things that go into goal-oriented approach when people choose environmental modeling as a career. For example, you might be into forestry and you are very interested in how to manage and plan the natural resources, how many trees we can cut, which parts of the forest need to be declared as the part of forest that human beings cannot interfere with. So how do we protect and preserve our natural resources? So you're not interested in how the model works or where else you can apply, you just want to get the data, the outcome. If I make this intervention A, what will be the impact in the amount of natural resources that are conserved or utilized? And then environmental impact assessment. Many people who do EIA are not actually expert in either the mathematics part of the modeling or understand even the field applications of the model. They just know how to run the model, get the data outcome, and then decide what kind of impact the project might have and what are the remediation measures that the company or the industry needs to take and whether they should get the clearance or not. And then overall system understanding. System understanding requires better understanding of both the application part and the processing part, little bit, not a lot. Mostly it is still under the domain of known outcome. So if you do decide to go into environmental modeling or if your career takes you there, these are the three very broad possibilities that your career can hold for you. One is to work on just I want to run the model or I want someone else to run the model and inform me the impact of interventions or activities, or you can go into the actual writing part of the model where we do the mathematics, where we do the processing, or you can go into the field applications. Personally, I prefer processing, but you know, the grass is green in all the three sides here. Okay, now let's look at the scope of our models. Now, the scope of the environmental models is truly multidisciplinary, and this is one of the reasons why environmental modeling is a very complex subject. When I use the word complex, I'm not talking about a subject that's hard to grasp or a subject that requires you to be master in 10 different disciplines. I'm borrowing the word complexity from mathematics, where complexity is defined as interdependence between variables. So in environment, the geochemistry might impact the kind of bacteria that grow, which will impact the kind of nutrient cycling that happens, which will impact the fate of the lake, whether it undergoes eutrophication or not, which will impact the usability of the lake, the potential algal toxins in the lake. So you see, geochemistry impacts all of it. And similarly, if the kind of microbes will impact the geochemistry and in the nutrient cycle, and they are all interacting with each other, all the variables, whether it is the microbes or the chemistry or the geology or the crystals in which your particular compounds are existing in the soil, or the human interventions that are happening, the kind of ecosystem we have in our water bodies, all of them interact with each other, which makes the mathematics of their relationship quite difficult to calculate. It's no longer linear, it's non-linear. And in the next lecture, I'll talk more about non-linear systems and why they're incredibly hard to analyze. So in that sense, environment is a very complex system, and the scope of environmental model is also multidisciplinary. I have written briefly 5 different major, very broad disciplines in which we use environmental modeling. So let's start with hydrology. When it comes to hydrology, we are looking at models that we use to estimate the behavior of surface runoff, the nutrient levels, the movement of surface runoff, the behavior of surface water, let's say with rivers, with lakes. And then subsurface, this is where the groundwater comes in, and we are also interested in hydrology. We are also interested in coastal. So for example, the behavior or the movement of coastal waters, their chemistry, their biology may interact with the groundwater of the coast and the surface water bodies near, which are not the marine. So freshwater water bodies near the coast. So hydrology in itself is also quite diverse. The ecological environmental models are very complicated. This is where the major chunk of environmental models are. In ecological environmental models, we can model the habitat. So you are modeling the place where life happens, and we are typically very targeted in these models. And since I'm not going very deep into the habitat kind of environmental models, because they are trying to model an entire system where we have chemistry, biology, physics all interacting with each other. So what we do is we typically simplify these processes a lot. So habitat models, they tend to have a lot of abstraction and generalization in them. Then in ecological models, we also look at communities. So for example, if I'm looking at environmental microbes, and I do a lot of work with environmental microbes, so I'm very interested in them. If I'm trying to model the behavior of environmental microbes, then I might want to look at how functionally and on taxonomic level that different communities of bacteria are evolving, changing, and I might want to model that. The other thing we do is population level models, like a very simple model that's taught to most civil engineers in first year or second year, is how the population in a city grows. And in fact, the first models that we'll study in this course are population models. Then we have evolutionary models, and this can be done on genetic level, population level, community level. We can also model the evolution of rocks, which are again part of environment, geological structures like rocks, or features like rivers, lakes, and what will happen to the dam and their stability over time. And then we have ecophysiology models. Ecological models are extremely diverse. And just talking about the first 2 bullets, I hope, just talking about the first 2 bullets just remove that whole part. Then we have soil and geological models. Now this is where we are interested in geological phenomena like landslides, earthquakes, volcanoes. We are interested in the behavior of soil, because soil and geology will impact how the rivers flow, will impact how the environment responds to geological changes, tectonic shifts. Again, a wide array of the model. Now, I want to emphasize this here. Even though I am very quickly listing different kinds of models within each of the disciplines listed here, each of the kind of models are their own specialization. So for example, if I am in ecological modeling and I am very interested in seeing the evolutionary pattern on genetic level, then that would be my specialization. I cannot extrapolate that to evolution of physiological phenomena in higher organisms, in higher order of life, if I'm looking at genetic level. So these are various specializations that I'm introducing you to. This is an extremely diverse field. And I hope you're not overwhelmed at this stage, because we are not going to, I'm not going to teach you 10 models in each field here. Don't worry. I'll tell you very specifically what we are going to teach. We are going to learn how to write very basic models that are applicable in all the fields. And then we also have psychology and economy-based models. You must have read articles about the economic cost of air pollution, the economic cost of water pollution. Recently, there was an article about the economic and public health cost, which is the harm of pollution in our major rivers like River Ganga, and how it is impacting neural health of people living near the River Ganga. So these models, where we try to estimate how much economy, how much GDP we are losing every year because of our air pollution, water pollution, the excessive use of pesticides, what is the public health burden, and what's the economic cost of it, what's the psychological cost of it. All of that also comes under environmental model. And then we have this big chunk here, climate models. And these are very complicated models. Now, there is a climate model that I use in my first year class, which finishes run in few minutes, and it gives a very brief estimate of sea level rise depending upon how much emission each group of countries are ready to make: developed, developing, LMIC, low income, Asia Pacific. So there are different country groups. And so that's a very simple climate model, a very rough model, very highly generalized and abstracted model, but still gives a pretty good estimation. And then we have very detailed aspects of climate that some models study. For example, I might be interested in sea level rise, or I might be interested in GHG emissions, I might be interested in carbon sequestration, I might be interested in changes in climate and its impact on the weather events, and what kind of weather events. So again, one can specialize in any one of these aspects of climate models. So students, this lecture I'll end here, and in the next lecture we'll continue our introduction on environmental modeling and simulation. Remember, the intention of the first two introductory lectures is to introduce you to the scope of the course, different aspects that are involved if you choose to have a career in environmental modeling. See you in the next lecture.